to Hotel Bar Sessions, the podcast where three philosophers sit down at the end of a long conference day to chop it up at the hotel bar, which, as we all know, is where the real philosophy happens.
Welcome to another episode of Hotel Bar Sessions. I'm Rick Lee, and as usual, I'm joined by my co-hosts Lee Johnson and David Gunkel, and today we are talking about the Palestinian question with a special guest, and we'll get to that in a moment. But before we do, we need some drinks, and I would like to know what you're ranting or raving about. David, let's start with you.
All right, so I will be drinking the Big Grove Oktoberfest since I'm in Iowa City for a talk at the University of Iowa. And the reason I want the Oktoberfest is because everywhere I go, they're sold out. So I figure it must be good, and I got to get myself a glass of it before I disappear from this location. And I'm going to be raving about Peter Salmon's book on Jacques Derrida called An Event Perhaps. So I obtained this book when it first came out several years ago and haven't had a chance to read it until just recently. And I've got to say, I don't read a lot of biographies, but this is a really well-done biography of Derrida. Salmon presents it as an intellectual history, and he situates Derrida within his time and place. And for people like myself who know the stories in fragments, it's a nice way of arranging all the puzzle pieces in a very readable narrative. And I recommend it to anyone who wants to know more about Derrida, but also wants to know how to put all the puzzle pieces together like I have.
And Lee, what about you and our special guest?
So I am just going to have a hot toddy today, and I am raving about autumn. I'm sure in part this is because I'm a Memphian and our summers are so brutal, but we finally got into the 70s. And so I am so happy to have a little bit of relief from the terrible, oppressive summer that we've had so far. Unfortunately, autumn in the Southeast, as everyone now very well knows, is also tornado and hurricane season. So, we trade one evil for another, but I am very glad to have the cooler weather with us now. So I am very happy to introduce our guest today, Zahi Zalloua. This is maybe the first time that we've done this, but we invited Zahi to join us by popular demand. So I was just recently at the SPEP conference in Rochester, New York, and while I was there, I was unable to see Zahi's paper, but I had at least a dozen people come and tell me that we had to invite him to be on the podcast. So I'm so glad that he agreed. Zahi Zalloua is the Cushing-Ells Professor of Philosophy and Literature and Director of Indigeneity, Race, and Ethnicity Studies at Whitman College. He's also the editor of The Comparatist. His recent teaching and scholarship engages critical Black studies, the post-human, and the Palestinian question. And his most recent book, which we will be discussing in part today, is titled The Politics of the Wretched, Race, Reason, and Ressentiment, which was published just this year by Bloomsbury in September of 2024. Zahi, welcome to the Hotel Bar. Thank you so much for joining us on such short notice. I'm very excited about our conversation today, but first we want to get a drink order and a rant or a rave from you.
Wonderful. Well, I would love another Bloody Mary, extra spicy.
Can I say this is the first guest who admitted they had already been drinking?
It's the toujours déjà tradition. So I would love to rave about the legacy of Comrade Fred. His legacy, his vision of Marxism touches us all. And the formulation, the good die young, Fred shows us that the good don't always have to die young. What do we have? We have Habermas. And God help us. So it's a rave and rant at the same time.
That might be a little bit of an inside baseball joke for philosophers only, but that was hilarious. Rick, what about you? What are you drinking and what are you ranting or raving about?
Well, as Lee said, the weather has turned to fall, and so I'm going to switch from a Negroni to a Boulevardier because I need the warming from the inside. And today I am raving about the podcast Slow Burn. I I know people have been talking about this ever since the first season, but this season they're doing the origin story of Fox News. And I have learned things I never knew. Like, for example, I didn't know Roger Ailes was involved in the Mike Douglas show. For our Gen Z listeners and younger, you probably don't know who he is, but think the blandest white guy you can, and somehow he got a talk show. It's a really excellent podcast, and I'm learning a lot about how our political discourse has changed in the United States and what an MF rat bastard Roger Ailes was from the beginning until the end. So, Lee, today we're talking about the Palestinian question. I'm sure by the end we're going to solve it. What piece are we going to take on?
Well, first of all, I want to say that earlier this month, in a speech at the United Nations General Assembly, Turkish President Recep Tayyip Erdogan did not mince words in describing the enormity of political peril, moral crisis, and human loss caused by the recent escalation of conflict between Israel and Palestine. He said, quote, "Gaza has become the largest cemetery for women and children in the world. Over 17,000 children have been the targets of Israeli bullets and bombs. In Gaza, not only are children dying, but the values the West claims to defend are dying. The truth is dying, and the hopes of humanity to live in a more just world are dying, one by one." End quote. The struggle over land, identity, and justice in a region 7,000 miles away from the United States has shaped global discourses on human rights, neocolonialism, and national self-determination for over a century. As violence and displacement continue to dominate the lives of millions of people, it has become harder and harder for Americans to ignore what we flippantly and often ignorantly refer to as the Middle East crisis. We can't ignore it anymore, because it isn't 7,000 miles away anymore. We see the protests on our streets and campuses. We hear or refuse to hear the dog whistles in our elected officials' speeches. We feel the tension in our neighborhoods, our churches and synagogues and mosques. We struggle to understand the implications of our investments or divestments. And day by day, we are numbed by the constant, unrelenting exposure to stories and videos and images and commentary on an almost unimaginably horrific human tragedy. In this episode of Hotel Bar Sessions, we are joined by philosopher Zahi Zalloua, whose new book, The Politics of the Wretched, offers a fresh lens through which to understand the complex affects and power dynamics that continue to fuel this struggle, particularly through the lens of what 19th century German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche called Ressentiment, or a deep-seated feeling of injustice and grievance. We're going to focus on Zalloua's insights in Chapter 4 on the Palestinian Question, where he unpacks how a collective sense of moral outrage on the part of Zionists has been deployed to shield Israel from criticism, particularly by accusing pro-Palestinian advocates and the left more generally of a new anti-Semitism. He contrasts this with Palestinian ressentiment, which he frames as a legitimate response to the ongoing reality of settler colonialism and displacement. Zalloua's work both critiques the complicity of liberal Zionism in maintaining the status quo and challenges us to reframe the way that we understand both Zionist and Palestinian anger. Now, under normal conditions, this would be the time for me to issue a content warning, because everything that follows is or should be traumatizing to persons of moral conscience. But I know that I speak for not only myself, but also my co-hosts and our guests when I say, do not stop listening. As Zalloua argues in his conclusion, quote, "To take up the Palestinian cause is to adopt the position of the feminist killjoy, the one who refuses to play nice, to uphold the idiocy of neutrality, to cover material that is not controversial, steering away from Palestine and Israel so as not to disrupt societies or the university's affective economy. The killjoy doesn't forget about Palestinian pain and refuses to stay silent. She does not manage her anger nor self-censor, but welcomes trouble and actively sabotages the happiness of those in power. So stay tuned as we try to actively sabotage the happiness of those in power."
Free Palestine.
Zahi, again, thank you so much for joining us. And I just want to say to our listeners that this new book, The Politics of the Wretched, is such a fantastic book. I described it to one of my friends as a page turner, which is a description not often used for philosophy monographs. But it really, really, really is a fantastic book. Obviously, in this episode, we're going to focus on your final chapter, The Palestinian Question. But I was hoping I could just give you a chance right here at the outset to maybe talk about the general argument of your book and situate this last chapter, or The Palestinian Question, in your larger argument about ressentiment.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. So the vision of the book frames the dialogue between Nietzsche and Kant. So I take from Kant's notion of the public use of reason versus the private use of reason, and his elevation of the public use of reason insofar as the public use of reason is what gestures to a universal ideal, whereas the private use of reason functions within a kind of organic community and reinforces what is in your self-interest, basically amounts to rootedness. So I take that public use structure and I try to engage it with ressentiment. And ressentiment has a fairly negative history in philosophy, marked by Nietzsche's critique that ressentiment fueled the slave revolt against life-affirming master morality. You know, Wendy Brown has linked ressentiment to this emergence of identity politics. So it's always about me, my pain, and my desire for revenge. So I wanted to acknowledge Wendy Brown's powerful critique of ressentiment, but try to say this really describes the private use of ressentiment. There is a possibility to think ressentiment otherwise. So I take the public use of ressentiment and locate it within critical Black studies, within colonial studies, and within the Palestinian question. And the three geographical sites are the United States, France, and Palestine, Israel. So try to see how ressentiment emerges. You know, how do you see white ressentiment that Marine Le Pen taps into? How do you see liberal Zionist ressentiment? How do you see Black rage and Black ressentiment fueled through the Afro-pessimists, through critique of Afro-pessimism for another more emancipatory Black ressentiment? So the chapter on Palestine tries to look at two competing models of ressentiment and see how there could be a public use of ressentiment within Israel. Udi Aloni's film Forgiveness, for me, stages a public use of ressentiment from the Jewish side, a kind of emancipatory Jewish side. But you also have the negative, the private use of ressentiment, which is more of an outrage. You know, folks who invested their energy, their affective energy, into their moral authority. So I stood with Israel all my life. Now Israel is being canceled. I'm losing my authority, so I strike at Palestinians and more especially their supporters. And there is a Palestinian private use of ressentiment that feeds your identity. You're the one who's been wronged. I'm sympathetic to that reaction because that's the reaction of the oppressed, the wretched. But I try through Fanon to dialecticize this ressentiment so that it opens to a collective ressentiment, that the Palestinian question becomes a universal question, not just one of grievance about me, my particular identity.
Zahi, it seems that we might want to carefully distinguish what someone might consider two different uses of the word public in what you're talking about.
Right.
Because the private use of ressentiment is certainly made public, particularly by politicians, right? And one could say that Donald Trump and Netanyahu and Le Pen, who you mentioned earlier, that they're actually publicly deploying what is actually an individual's affect, which should be kept to oneself, versus a different sense of the public use of ressentiment that I think in the end of what you just said is something more collective, right? It's not my individual feeling, but it is the appropriate response to the conditions of oppression that I am experiencing. Am I right about that?
You're right. For me, the private use of ressentiment is about identity politics. And identity politics, of course, has a public dimension.
Right.
That's its currency.
Right.
But it refers back to me, my people, my kin, my semblable in French, right? The one who looks like me. It's very organic. It's very rooted. And it excludes, it needs the other as the enemy. So Marine Le Pen does this, Trump does this, Netanyahu does this, the Biden-Harris regime does this. In a different context, I also think about solidarity as grounded in public use of ressentiment. To frame it within a psychoanalytic structure, it is about the death drive, right? What is beyond the pleasure principle? And here you can see how identity politics follows a pleasure principle. It reinforces what is in my interests. My action, my politics, my aspirations are guided with what is good to me. The public use of ressentiment embraces a death drive that exceeds what is good to me, what is good for me. So Jared Sexton, one of the leading Afro-pessimists, formulates it as what is in the struggle more than the struggle itself, the spirit of solidarity. And I adopt this. I think for a solidarity that is worthy of its name, it has precisely to exceed what is good for me. You have to put yourself at risk, right? So when Palestinians align themselves with Black Lives Matter, they're welcoming white terror. When blacks line themselves up behind Palestinians, they're welcoming the charge of anti-Semitism. A true politics accepts the hate you will receive because you're driven by an ethical cause.
Yeah.
And I think the public use of ressentiment moves us in that direction.
And this is a point you make in the book, I think, very well, is that this private use really is rooted in a Cartesian subject, right? And we think about collectivity as a product of individuals coming together. That's one way of thinking of the collective. But there's another way of thinking about the collective where the individual arises out of the community in which they're already embedded.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that's the move towards the universal. That what I'm actually positing there is not my French, my Palestinian, my American identity. I'm positing a kind of cosmopolitan identity. I mean, I think that's the beauty of the public use of reason that Kant puts forward. My vision of ressentiment is not divorce of reason either. I mean, that's why reason is in the subtitle. You have race, reason, and ressentiment. So there is a reason behind ressentiment that is often ignored. People typically see ressentiment as an irrational outburst. And I want to try to argue that this ressentiment can be dialecticized. There is a reason guiding its vision, but it's a vision that is not divorced of the bite of ressentiment. So I keep the bite that Nietzsche observed, but I don't make the bite the end in itself, right? So sometimes a public use of ressentiment could be too welcoming to the other. So you need the reminder of the private use of ressentiment. You know, there is always this great push of forget and forgive. Let's move forward. And for me, the aspiration of ressentiment came from Jean Améry, a Holocaust survivor who wrote about ressentiment, pushing against Germany's post-war ambition. Let's move forward. Let's put behind all our problems. So I was inspired by Améry, and I'm still inspired by Améry, but I'm very critical of the way he turns back to Israel, how the negativity that he harnessed in his resistance to Germany's narrative of moving forward comes to a halt when it comes to Israel. His public use of ressentiment becomes a private use of ressentiment.
Right.
He has to identify with Israel as a Zionist. Israel becomes the last protection against an Uber Auschwitz. And for me, this is where he betrays, in a sense, a potential collaboration with Palestinians, with other wretched.
I'd like to focus on the reason of this Zionist ressentiment for just a minute, because I want us to have the opportunity later to contrast it with what you call Palestinian ressentiment. But earlier, you described Zionist ressentiment as more about the perceived loss of moral authority than a reaction to anti-Semitism. And it does appear that one of the consequences of this, one of the ways that it is used, is to level the charge of what you call and what many people call the new anti-Semitism. So I really appreciated you just a minute ago noting that this can also be dialecticized. And I would like for you to kind of draw that out for our listeners.
Yeah, and I think some ressentiment has a future. The ressentiment that fuels the new anti-Semitism has no future because that ressentiment is built on defending my identity as a Zionist, as a defender of Israel. You go against Israel, you go against my authority. So this charge of anti-Semitism is world canceling. I mean, there is hardly anything that meets its devastation because anti-Semitism is a horror, right? It's a plague. When the charge gets weaponized, it's devastating. But here, what is motivating the accusation is the feeling that you're losing your authority, your moral authority. Somebody is enjoying your authority. So this theft of enjoyment fuels the mechanism of ressentiment. Palestinians have to avoid these traps. I mean, ressentiment is very tempting because it builds on your rage, and that rage could be channeled back into an identity, us against them. When Fanon talks about this Manichaean universe of the colonizer and the colonized, he understands that the violence that has to emerge as a counter-violence to the originary violence of the colonizer has to be understood through a Manichaean lens, but it can't end there, right? The counter-violence has to create a way to break from the binarism of Manichaean logic. I think Zionists of all shades, and especially liberal Zionists, are comfortable with that binary opposition. They constantly want to put the Palestinians in the side of the irrational. So the liberal Zionist, for me, is really the enemy of the book. You know, with right-wing Republicans, the fascist rights in Europe, it's clear what you're getting from them. It's the liberals that...
It's always the liberals. We're exercising a collective sigh here.
Yeah, because, you know, with the Netanyahu, you have disaster occupation. You have them taking advantage. But you look at the supposed peace camp, the liberal Zionists, they want occupation on cruise control. They want October 6th. And October 6th is intolerable for Palestinians then, and it's intolerable now. In a larger framework, also liberalism allows you to sustain this fetishist disavowal. So you can say anything. You know, I know anti-blackness is horrible in America. Nonetheless, all the same, I believe in the American dream. I believe everybody can make it on their own. Same thing with Israel. I know Palestinians are being abused by the Netanyahu regime. All the same, I believe in a Jewish and democratic Israel. I believe in a two-state solution. So liberal Zionism sustains the life of that fetishist disavowal. And until that is really disrupted, nothing can happen. So basically, the gift of Netanyahu is that he has cannibalized the liberal Zionist position. It doesn't exist. It cannot exist after Gaza, after the genocide and the Israeli support of the genocide, which is devastating to watch. I remember shortly after the Sabra and Shatila massacres in the early 80s, you had 300,000 Israeli Jews protesting in Tel Aviv against the government's responsibility in their invasion of Lebanon, how they allowed the phalangists to massacre the Palestinians.
Yeah.
Where is the outrage now?
Right.
It doesn't exist. The outrage is over Netanyahu and the hostages. Questions of occupation don't exist.
I think this, for me, was one of the most important points you make in the book, that the deployment of anti-Semitism from the point of view of liberal Zionists very clearly shows that we need a new category of analysis for politics. And it seems like that's one thing that gets you to this understanding of ressentiment, because we really don't have another category to understand how it is that a liberal Zionist who is proclaiming, on the one hand, liberal political values and rights, and maybe even has a universalist message of freedom for all and so on, now is speaking the language of, as you put it, two-state solution, but the settler-colonialism, that question is never raised. Or as you put it, and I like this, you borrow it from Du Bois, that the wages of being an Israeli, the wages of Israel, are not settled. They're not dealt with.
You know, Du Bois's framework of this wage of Jewishness, the libidinal kick of feeling you belong to a country, that no matter how bad your economic condition is, and this could be the Mizrahi Jews, the Ethiopian Jews, you're at least better off than Palestinians. Palestinian citizens of Israel, and Palestinians, obviously, in the occupied territories. So this libidinal kick of belonging to a Zionist Israel is hard to undo. There's a libidinal attachment to Jewishness. And what we saw briefly before October 6th was the large protests against the far-right messianic coalition that Netanyahu put together to redefine Jewishness, move it away from its secular aspirations. And that was freaking out liberal Zionists when they saw this attempt to redefine what Jewishness means.
Yeah.
But I think we have to go all the way down. We have to divorce this vision of Jewishness from its gratification that comes at the expense of Palestinians. So, how do you transform the Israeli Jewish subject? I mean, I don't think you can avoid a model of self-violence, of symbolic suicide, which I see happening in Udi Aloni's film Forgiveness, where his main character, David, recognizes his role in being part of the Israeli killing machine. So, spoiler alert, at the end, when he has his reckoning with his action, what he did, it's not only his self-transformation, it's what do you do afterwards?
Right.
Do you have to rage for Palestinians? Right? This is not about an individual overcoming. You become a tool for liberation if you really take up the Palestinian cause. I go back to Fanon again when he talks about decolonizing the mind. He has the colonizer and the colonized in mind. Both of them, in a sense, have to strike at themselves. And I get this through Zizek's reading of Fanon, Zizek's general model of philosophy or politics as a reckoning with your identity. Anything that can puncture your symbolic identity, your gentrified identity, is potentially emancipatory. And I think the self-violence here is missing on the Israeli side. Palestinians are already in a position of self-destitution. The question is, how can they exit out of the zone of non-being in a way that doesn't put Jewish Israelis in the zone of non-being? So I think a just resolution has to incorporate both people. I'm still a one-stater. The two-state solution is a fake gesture of hope, ultimately.
Hey, Hotel Bar Session listeners, this is Rick Lee. Do you know what kind of pillow I use or mattress I sleep on? No, of course you don't. And that's because we don't have any of those stupid ads for pillows or mattresses or any other crap that you don't even want. We are supported by you, our listeners. And if you want to keep our late night conversations flowing, why not do the equivalent of buying us a drink or giving us a high five? You could subscribe to our podcast at Patreon. That's patreon.com/hotelbarsessions. And you could subscribe at many levels. And hey, there's perks at those levels. You could get a coffee mug, or I might even call you out on an episode, or you could get early access to some of our episodes. There are lots of perks there, and we could really use your help. So go to patreon.com/hotelbarsessions and subscribe at any level you feel comfortable with. In the meantime, we'll see you back at the bar.
So Zahi, as I mentioned earlier, I do think it's really important for us in our conversation here to make the same contrast you do in your book, which is to contrast Zionist ressentiment with Palestinian ressentiment. And you consider Palestinian ressentiment to be a legitimate response to settler-colonialism. But of course, many people portray Palestinian resistance as irrational violence. So how does your framing and the argument that you make in this book challenge these narratives?
I mean, this is the question that this chapter is trying to answer. So there is this inability to see Palestinian actions as reactions to an originary violence. What is easier to do is just to see the violence Palestinians commit as an expression of their being, their anti-Semitic being, their irrational being. Zionists get a lot of mileage out of this. So you have a whole history of Orientalism. You have the war on terror.
Yeah.
And you have a kind of Zionism that wants to put both of them together. Right, from Sharon to Netanyahu, you've had that logic of demonizing Palestinians, making them inherently violent, inherently unsympathetic to the suffering of Jews. So once you consider Palestinians as engaged in counter-violence, then you have to acknowledge there's an originary violence. What is that originary violence? It's settler-colonialism. Then the major distinction between 48 and 67. What's the problem here? Is the problem the occupation or is the problem 48, settler-colonialism? There's a consensus among activists, scholars of Palestine. The problem is 48. It's never been 67. 67 imagines still the problem as a conflict over territory, that Palestinians are not confronting invaders. So once you see Israeli soldiers, right, once you see the IDF as an IOF, not a defensive force, an occupation force, an offensive force, and what's happening in Lebanon clearly shows this. You're not defending Israel, you're attacking a neighboring country. So even in the language, right, the IDF, Israeli Defensive Forces, is radically misleading. It is ideology at its purest. So once you see Israel as an invader, then we can begin asking questions. How do you resist an invader? You're entitled to armed struggle. You can target military targets. You can't target civilians. I think one has to be consistent. One can make that distinction. The move among liberals is no. Any kind of violence is unacceptable.
Right.
If liberals sympathize with Palestinians, it's usually around two possibilities. I feel sorry for Palestinians because either they're dead or they're dying. There is an impossibility to see them as freedom fighters. So I'm very moved by the protests, by the encampments. And we have this at Whitman College with our wonderful students. And they're demanding more, right? They don't want to see Palestinians as mere victims. It's one moment, right? You have to see them as victims to see the Israelis as victimizers, not as those who monopolize victimhood. But you can't stop there. And I think the kind of liberal reason wants to contain Palestinians as victims so they can authorize humanitarian aid. But what we need to see here is Palestinians within an anti-colonial framework, where anti-colonial reason, not humanitarian reason, dictates.
One of the powerful consequences of your drawing this back to settler colonialism is that in an interesting and important way, it helps us connect what is going on in the context of Israel-Palestine with a larger political movement around the world, which then has a number of rippling consequences. One is it opens up paths for incredible solidarity among peoples that might not otherwise realize that they can find such solidarity. Another consequence of it is that it reminds us in the West that 1948 was not something Israel did. This is something that the then international community brought about. I think often when we, for example, in the U.S., criticize Israel's practices, there's a certain comfort in that. And the comfort is, well, that's what they're doing. That's something that is their problem and they're bad for doing it. And we forget about 48, right? And so I think you're bringing us back to the root of settler colonialism is really important as an analytical tool, but also in helping us see all of these consequences, both negative and I think what I love about your book is also positive. That's where we're driving, right? To the positive.
I mean, this is where I love the contrast. You have Marine Le Pen expressing her support for Israel. You have Red Nation, the indigenous activist group in Ireland, lending their support to Palestinians. You have BLM chapters lending their support to Palestinians. I like who your friends are, right? And if your friends are right-wing fascists and your friends are activists looking for social justice, that tells you something for the external observer. The question of settler colonialism has to link it back to Canada, has to link it back to the United States. And in Israel, we're seeing a kind of unfinished founding violence. There's a founding violence that desperately wants to naturalize itself, to say, yes, all modern nations have a violent history, but we've moved on. We've granted some formal abstract rights for everybody, but the game is over. We won, and we can recognize you as equals within the framework of the settler state, which is no longer a settler, it's just reality.
Right.
You know, you've had activists in Canada and the United States who refuse to believe this, who see in Palestine a desire to reignite, to denaturalize the founding violence here in the United States and in Canada. And they're lending the support in their refusal to naturalize this founding violence. I mean, you still have Palestinians who are older than the state of Israel, right? Israel is playing the long game. If we kill enough Palestinians, if we transfer enough Palestinians, then we can give some Palestinians some rights, universal rights. But until we're there, we have to eliminate them the ugly way. We actually have to kill them before we can just integrate them and dissolve their Palestinian identity. So just an insight about how a Zionist state is very alarmed by the very idea of Palestinians. People who never left in 48, right, the Nakba survivors, they're not seen as Palestinian citizens of Israel. They're seen as Arab citizens of Israel. They're never recognized for their Palestinianness because Palestinianness as such doesn't exist. You just have Arabs. In a telling essay by Levinas, Zionisms, when he's talking about the conflict over the land, he formulates it, Israel is in war with those who call themselves Palestinians. Mm-hmm. That formulation, they call themselves Palestinians, introduces a kind of doubt. It derealizes the Palestinians by questioning their own identity. How can you have peace when you're not even recognized as Palestinian? You're just an Arab, and Arabs become this, large horde surrounding Israel, threatening Israel, not the Palestinian who's the victim of victims.
I just want to emphasize how important the settler-colonialism approach to this entire dialogue is in your book. And I think especially for readers in the West, this opens up new ways of thinking about the Palestinian question, which I don't think are often seen because we are siding oftentimes with the colonizers, especially in the U.S. And I think problematizing that, as Rick points out, builds some possibility of solidarity across different colonized subjects that open this up to critical intervention beyond the sort of simple binary of colonized colonizer. And I think that's a real powerful message in your book.
Thank you, David. About 6 months ago, Judith Butler was doing a roundtable in France, and they framed the problem around settler-colonialism, that you have to see what Hamas is doing, not as an act of terrorism or an act of anti-Semitism, that actually they hate Jews. You're resisting an invader. It doesn't matter who's your invader. We have to frame it this way first. Then we can examine what kind of action should we encourage. If we don't want armed struggle, the killing of anybody, then let's foreground BDS, the boycott, divestment, sanctions movement. Before you trash violence, open yourself to nonviolence as a model. But for the liberal American, no. Hamas and BDS are both anti-Semitic. So Palestinians are put in this impossible position because they're never seen as resisting an invader. You always hear Israel's right to self-defense. The right to self-defense of the occupier is not enshrined in international law. And that right is constantly evoked. The occupier's civilian population must be protected. Absolutely. But the idea that Israel has a right to defend itself when it's an occupying force, absolutely not. We can't accept this.
I mean, all due respect to Judith Butler, but I think it does matter who the invader is. And one of the things I really like about your argument in this book, especially as you've just been saying, refocusing the attention on this as a problem of settler colonialism, post-1948, post-Nakba, that then we have to think about all of this within the logic of the nation state. And it matters if a nation state is invading me or, I don't know, my asshole neighbor is invading me, right?
Sure.
I mean, that's a huge difference. And one of the things that I think a lot of people struggle with, and unfortunately a lot of academics struggle with now, is how to articulate what I think we all realize is a pretty obvious difference between opposing the actions of groups like Hamas and opposing Palestinian humanity, as well as, opposing Israel state politics and being anti-Semitic. Those are not the same things. And I'm just hoping that maybe you could help some people explain those differences, which I think are hugely important differences, not only because to accuse someone of being pro-terrorist or to accuse someone of being anti-Semitic, as you just said, is a conversation ender. There's nothing else to say after that.
Yeah. I mean, it ends your career.
Yeah.
It could potentially end your livelihood. It could put you in harm's way. Mm-hmm. I mean, for me, humanity as a category is very elusive. So, when I teach Fanon in my class, Black Skin, White Mask, a spectacular text, on the first page of the introduction, he's asking, why am I writing this book? Towards the new humanism? He asks this as a question. And students, everybody's excited to see Fanon as proposing a humanism. But the humanism that he's proposing has to go through a radical undoing of the human.
Yeah, it's both a promise and a refusal.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a desire to redefine the human, but how the human gets created, gets evoked. Can you have a human that doesn't follow a logic that for me to matter, you must unmatter?
Right.
And so far, we don't have that logic. So when you say Black Lives Matter, Palestinian Lives Matter, you're stating the obvious, that they should matter, but under what rubric can you matter? You matter, but you matter in a way that still operates under a humanitarian reason. You're a suffering body, you matter. So we like MLK as a decaffeinated subject, as a toothless subject that only advocates for nonviolence and toleration. But in fact, MLK, and Michelle Alexander has a wonderful piece in The Nation, he was writing against the Vietnam War.
Right.
People canceled MLK from within his own community. What a grave mistake he did. So I think that MLK who argued for nonviolence against militarism, against capitalism, who walked with white workers, that's the MLK we need to bring back, where nonviolence is in fact a violent act to the system. It delegitimizes the system. And this is what Israel is fearing. Its legitimacy as a democratic state has been obliterated. A younger generation of Jews don't identify with Israel. They don't identify with Israel. They see it as an apartheid regime. And I think we need to build on this different relationship between Israel and its Jewish population in the diaspora. This will exert more pressures on Israel. And what keeps me up at night is, what would it take to transform Israeli Jews? And I can see BDS, I can see all the objections against genocide as hardening their hearts, not loosening it up, not compelling them to reimagine their position.
So do you think it would be fair to say that one of the consequences of the argument that you're making in this book is that Zionist ressentiment is a reification of the logic of the nation state, and Palestinian ressentiment is a resistance to the logic of the nation state?
I believe so. So what I see in Palestinian ressentiment is precisely what Jean Amery was pushing for. A refusal to forget the Nakba, a refusal to forget the Naksa, 67, a refusal to accept the illegal settlements. Because, even under the two-state solution, what are you going to do with 700,000 Israelis living illegally in these outposts and settlements? You would have to dismantle them. I mean, there's always this idea, a two-state solution will redraw the boundaries. There needs to be a reckoning.
Right.
You need to dismantle the traces of your racism. So when United States give Israel $3.8 billion, this should go into reparation. Forget their military package. And the West must line up because they're complicit in Israel's domination of Palestinian land for decades now. So, what can provoke this? I think understanding Palestinian ressentiment, understanding how the rage can easily translate into the private use of ressentiment, but to help Palestinians, give them outlets where their ressentiment is actually linked to a collective struggle, which they're doing. Activists in Gaza are in dialogue with indigenous groups and black activists. So we need to multiply what Zizek calls these proletarian positions. Because, the proletariat subject, the working class as a revolutionary agent is no longer available. We need to multiply these other sites and exert pressure on a world that is becoming more visible, right? The viciousness of the world is becoming more visible. So one of the concepts that I keep returning to is Achille Mbembe's The Becoming Black of the World. With racial slavery, we had this pure commodification of the human being, but it's no longer limited to black bodies, African bodies. Anybody can become, in a sense, black in this world. And with Gaza, we're seeing the Gazification of the world. And this is why the population, the civilians, are outraged by this return to a kind of old model of coloniality, where colonials used to do whatever they want because they made up the laws. But, post-World War II, there's supposed to be new guidelines guiding conflict, guiding wars. But Israel is somehow immune. Israel is outside these laws. And that's radically scary. for anybody. Anybody should be alarmed by this.
Hey listeners, have you ever thought to yourself, I'd really love to join them after this episode for a drink? Well, you could do that if you wanted to fly Rick and David from Chicago or me from Memphis to wherever you are, and we're not taking that option off the table. But in the meantime, we'd love to hear back from all of you via social media. You can reach us on Twitter at Hotel Bar Podcast, on Facebook, and on YouTube. You can always email us at hotelbarpodcast@gmail.com, and we will respond. Look, we know you're out there. We've got the data, and we want to hear from you. Books or articles we should read, interview guests we should have, topics we should cover, we're listening. Sometimes podcasting feels like shouting into a void, and so we always appreciate hearing back from our listeners. In the meantime, back to the episode.
So I don't know if you know this piece of music by the band PIL, but they have a song called Rise. And at the end of Rise, Johnny Lydon chants over and over again, anger is an energy, anger is an energy. This idea that anger, ressentiment, or however you want to call it, can be channeled in this public use as a way to create change. I think that's a refrain I kept hearing in my mind as I was reading your book.
Absolutely. I mean, I like raging against the machine for a reason. You rage with others. I mean, you're raging against injustice. So there's a kind of negativity built in these bad affects, rage, anger, ressentiment, and they're easily dismissible for that reason. This is why philosophers have, for the longest time, denigrated anger. From the Stoics to Nussbaum is a loss of self-mastery. Ressentiment with Nietzsche is cancerous. It produces self-hate. It doesn't affirm life. It negates life. I think we can think now, with black anger being reconceptualized, that in a sense, anger, as Audre Lorde puts it, is the appropriate response to racism. How can you not be angry? And Said's distinction between normality for the Israeli Jew and abnormality as a normal condition of Palestinians. I think the days where we posited this whole normal subject is no longer credible. When anger becomes constitutive of your existence, you wake up angry. Each morning you get out of the bed, you want to scream. We watch Democracy Now! In the morning, and we're outraged by the time we have to go to work. Mm-hmm. But, I don't want to flee from this outrage. Mm-hmm. I want to channel this rage into my writing, into my teaching, into my activism.
Following up on that, in this last chapter, you propose something that you call a co-constitutive politics of ressentiment that links the Jewish and the Palestinian struggle. Yeah. And I have to tell you, I had to stop and take a breath when I read that phrase, because given everything that you had argued so far, that did not appear as a possibility for where this argument was going. Yeah. And I think that it's an incredibly provocative suggestion.
Yeah.
So I just want to give you a chance for our listeners who haven't read the book yet to expand on what you mean by co-constitutive politics of ressentiment, how this could function in practice, what kind of steps you envision for creating a political framework that transcends this binary of oppressor and oppressed.
Yeah, thank you, Lee. So, in that chapter, I take up Bruno Shawat's book, Is Theory Good for the Jews? Short answer, it's not. Because it opens up to a new anti-Semitism of the left. Mm. And he comes to represent the measured, academic, pro-Zionist vision of things. And he lines up how all these intellectuals are threats. Post-Heideggerians are a threat. Agamben is a threat. Zizek is a threat. I would have been a threat if you had read me. But there is a special ire to people like Judith Butler. So Judith Butler is bad for the Jews. Udi Aloni is bad for the Jews. And I wanted to give Aloni, in the last section of the book, his say. How, in a sense, we can give up on a Jewish ressentiment that is emancipatory, that cares for the Palestinians. In many ways, Udi Aloni is more Palestinian than Mahmoud Abbas. Mm. He wants radical change. He wants to live with the other. He sees himself as more Palestinians than his liberal Zionists in Tel Aviv. So to refuse the framework imposed by Shawat and others that Jews are behind Israel, Palestinians and their Western supporters are behind Palestinians, I wanted to evoke that true change has to be both from within and from the outside. We're offering our critique from the outside. We can't shut down the critique from within. I think people like Aloni and some very few others, like Plus 972 magazine, I mean, they're doing amazing work, but they have no reality in public discourse. So in my writings, I try to make this gesture of constitutive ressentiment, that my ressentiment can't be my own. This is where, in essence, I'm trying to respond to Wendy Brown's concerns how ressentiment fuels identity politics. So my ending is a negation of identity politics for an emancipatory leftist vision that joined forces with Jewish voices within Israel.
There is a way this co-constitutive politics turns on the fact that, let's say, the revenge aspect of ressentiment could be directed at a revenge of the oppressor, maybe with a capital O, universal, like wherever, whoever, revenge. And you talk a bit in your last chapter about the phrase never again, and the debate about never again for everyone, never again for whom. And I think that helped me see what this co-constitutive politics of ressentiment could look like, namely never again for everyone. And it should be said, lest our listeners who haven't read the book come away with a different idea, Zahi is not denying the historical struggles of Jewish people. There's no notion that the idea behind having a place for the Israelis who had just suffered the Shoah to no longer have to deal with that, none of that is in question. What is in question is the way in which that can turn into this private use of ressentiment as a politics in which they can't come together in solidarity with another form of the oppressed.
Just the fact that you feel like you have to deliver that caveat, I think, is an example of the argument of Zahi's book, right? That the liberal Zionists and the new anti-Semitism are actually impeding Palestinian solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, for me, the never again imperative, how it's read by Netanyahu in a purely self-interested fashion, it can only be deployed to reinforce Israeli hegemony, reinforce Israeli identity. Never again becomes the just cause for genocide. So in what world can never again authorize genocide?
Right.
So, the movement, if not now, Jewish Voice for Peace, read it sympathetically, never again. Or to use Said, read it contrapuntally. It affects Palestinians and Jews.
Right.
It resists this identitarian logic informing that vicious deployment. I mean, same from the river to the sea. Palestine will be free. It's aspirational. It's about Palestinian unity, where the Zionist regime, from its inception, has sought to divide Palestinians. Where you have a genocidal version of it is in the Likud chapter. From the river to the sea, all you will see is Jewish sovereignty. That's genocidal. But the irony is, in public discourse, in mainstream media, when you think of genocide from the river to the sea, it's Palestinians and their supporters who are accused. And that's a crying shame.
I noticed that you ended, and I actually quoted it at the top of this episode, that you ended the book by appealing to the figure of the feminist killjoy. I want to give you a chance just to take a minute to talk about how gender figures into this conflict. The subtitle of your book is Race, Reason, and Ressentiment. But as we know, in all conflicts where race is at issue, women and children suffer. And so I just wanted to give you a chance to maybe explain why you end with the feminist killjoy.
Because I think there's something remarkable about this desire to puncture feeling good. When you're feeling good, it's predicated on the oppression and silencing of others. I think feminist queer theorists have been on the side of Palestinians because they recognize this muscular Zionism is devastating for all of us. In an earlier Gaza war, there were supporters of Israel carrying images like Hamas is a woman and saying, come, please finish us. So I had described Netanyahu as not the commander-in-chief, but the rapist-in-chief. This vision of sexual violence, domination, penetration should alarm us all, but also feminists particularly. So, when people say, what's the link between Palestine and the feminist and queer resistance? Everything. June Jordan is not an aberration. Angela Davis is not an aberration.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that anyone would ask what's the relationship between Palestine and feminist or queer resistance. And it seems one of the most compelling arguments of your book is that all resistance movements are linked, right? I mean, are related.
I think the reality of Zionist feminists is as real as neoliberal feminists. So if you believe in neoliberal feminists, you're likely to believe in Zionist feminists. Mm-hmm. But if we're critical about what feminism stands for, you would reject both models.
And I think in an interesting way that hooks up with your discussion earlier in our conversation about a notion of humanism that might be involved in Fanon and even other struggles for liberation. That puts me in mind of Sylvia Wynter's project of working through
Absolutely.
What the notion of the human has been constituted in order to maybe for the first time come to humanity, that we need a deconstruction of the human in order to come out the other side. That came to my mind precisely because, as Lee was asking about the feminist killjoy, one part of that is the killjoy part, which I appreciate your argument that the joy that we experience is a joy of oppression, a joy in being the oppressor, as you put it, the libidinal pleasure we receive in this, and that should be killed. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The sadness is not that there are feminist killjoys. The sadness is that there's not a whole lot more.
Mm-hmm. Wonderfully put. And I think in the introduction of the book, I bring up Derek Bell's example of Biona McDonald's, an older black woman activist who shares Derek Bell's vision of racial realism. Racism, anti-blackness is baked into this world. So she's not naive, she's not optimistic, but there's a libidinal kick the other way around, right? Her formulation is, I live to harass white folks. And I love this. But the joy you derive is not to reinforce your identity. It's just to poke at the bear, right? It's to poke at the obscene oppressor. It's to refuse to yield. Enjoyment has to be embraced, but it's not an enjoyment that is, about punching down, which is often the case when people align themselves with Israel and the enjoyment of aligning themselves with settler states. They're punching down. They're punching on the wretched of the world. And the killjoy feminist is taking up the position of the wretched. In my acknowledgement, I talk about who am I to talk about the wretched. I'm a professor at a liberal arts college. I can hardly be called wretched. And I evoke a brief biographical history, which I'm not a huge fan of biographies of myself. But, my parents fled the Nakba. I was born in Lebanon, left when there was a civil war. All this as part of Israel's invasion. I experienced racism of the French style. And I experienced the headaches of immigration in the United States.
You're welcome.
Sure. I think you could be destituted as the wretched. And you can be moved by the wretched. And this is where the self-violence, symbolic suicide comes in. I think there's ways in which we can join forces and contest this overrepresentation of men, of the human as men, as Wynter puts it very powerfully. Yeah. And each of my work builds on what I left out or not explored fully. And Sylvia Wynter is at the top of my list. The production of the human, the coloniality of being itself. And she's a very good reader of Fanon, right? She constantly brings in the wretched, les damnés. Right, that's her preference rather than the Afro-pessimist distinction between not quite human and non-human, the degraded human and the non-human. I think that becomes too limited and disastrous for solidarity, for cross-racial solidarity.
Well, Zahi, unfortunately, we are under the oppressive rule of our bartender here at this podcast. After a certain amount of time each episode, she gives us last call and we have to wrap this up. I cannot tell you how much I appreciate, again, you coming and being on this podcast and on such short notice. This has been a fantastic conversation. Your book is definitely one of the best books that I've read this year, and I encourage everyone to go out and buy it. It's The Politics of the Wretched. It's Bloomsbury. But before we get out of here, I want to give you a chance to give us your final thoughts or anything you'd like our listeners to take with them.
You know, we're past a year of genocide, and our choices right now in the United States, Harris and Trump. We have to demand better. We have to demand a different vision. We have to, in a sense, come to terms with how Palestine has disclosed a gash in our global social fabric. So I think it is a demand that is made on all of us to align ourselves with the cause of the unjust, people who are suffering an injustice. And we have to imagine a world where social justice still means something. And to do so, I think we have to embrace a reconfiguration of the order of things. If we don't do that, we're going to be revisiting Gaza in 5 more years and an even more devastating genocide.
So, Zahi, I just want to say I really enjoyed reading your book. I encourage people who have been struggling with this Palestinian question to pick it up, because I think Lee said early on, it's a page turner, but it's a page turner with incredible insight and critical apparatus in play. And I think it can really help inform a much more interesting and hopefully useful dialogue.
I also want to join Lee in thanking you for joining us for this really important conversation. And what you just said reminded me of something Adorno says in Minima Moralia, that a philosophy that thinks in the light of redemption is one that exposes the fissures of the world we live in. And I think that's really powerful, what you just said. And so, again, I just want to thank you. And I co-sign Lee's suggestion that everyone listening go buy the book.
Thank you so much. This was amazing.
Thank you also, Zahi, and free Palestine. Solidarity.